Good morning. Man, I thought about this yesterday. I wanted to leave it alone, but then, well, I just didn't know how to say it or express what I'm about to say. But I was reading in my Bible, and it's funny because I read it like I think it was today's Wednesday, probably yeah Monday, and I'm in Ephesians 3, and Paul, and there's so much things that God would show me in Ephesians, but here's one thing that stood out to me. And he starts praying. He says he's praying for the Ephesian church. And he says that you may know the love of God, the that surpasses all understanding, the width, the length, the depth, the height of God's love. And when I hear stuff like that, it's just like my first thing is, oh, it's so beautiful. That's wonderful. I want to know this kind of love, and and then I said, look what Paul's saying. God's you. It's so wide, it's huge, it's so length, it's so long, depth, it goes so deep, height, it's so tall. God's love is so big. It's like throwing a rock in the ocean. How could you miss it? Because the ocean is so big. How could you throw a rock at the ocean and miss it? That's how big the ocean is. You can't miss it. And that's how big God's love is. But many are going to miss it. When I read that scripture, I always read it from a place of hope and this is wonderful. But this is the first time I looked at it, or my eyes was open to it differently. God's love is so big, but people will still miss it. And that's scary. And now I started thinking, I'm starting to think, I'm seeing differently. That you can miss something that big. And I start realizing how we view the world. The world is more real than God. What we see, what we feel, what we experience in the natural world, it's more realer to people than God who's in spirit. And the truth is, God who's in spirit is the reality. It's true reality. It's more real than this place. But this world, we will fall under the deception that this is the real world and God, the spirit, is the fantasy. It's opposite. This world is fantasy. And that fantasy is going to turn into a nightmare real fast. And see, the fantasy, it's pleasing to the eye. It's pleasing to the ear. It shows you it only shows you what you want to see. Fantasy cannot show you the other side. Fantasy only shows you what you want to see. And if fantasy only shows you what you want to see, then that's not reality. This is how we know God is reality. Because he shows us the truth. He shows things for what they are and what it is and what things can be. And because God is not your reality, too busy living in the fantasy. And we got addicted to the fantasy. We got addicted to seeing what we want to see, hearing what we want to hear. That's why we get so defensive when we hear the truth, because the truth slices and cuts right through that fantasy. It shows that that fantasy that you're living was not reality. And we've fallen in love with the fantasy. We've fallen in love with something that was meant to break you. And then we despise the very thing that could sit here and build you up and make you, which is the love of God. And many people are missing the love of God because they love the fantasy that the world tries to make you think that's reality. And that fantasy is leading you to a path away from God, separated from God. How could God's love know width, length, depth, height? A love that surpasses all understanding, and you can still miss it. God is the reality, and this world is a fantasy that's gonna, and if we don't wake up, that fantasy, once the fantasy is revealed, then you're gonna realize you've been living in a nightmare. Like I said, fantasy only shows you what you want to see. That's the dangerous parts about the fantasy. Never shows you the other part. Never shows you the other half. You ever fantasize about something? Isn't it ironic when you fantasize about something, everything goes the way that you want it to go in that fantasy? But then when you try to act upon that fantasy in real time reality, in reality, it doesn't work out the way that you fantasize it to be. How many times people try things that they shouldn't have been trying in relationships because they saw it, because they fantasized about it, and in their fantasy and in their mind, it went a certain way. But when you actually participated in that fantasy, it didn't go the way that you saw it in your head. That is a dangerous way to live. And most people will live that. They live to fulfill their fantasy. That's not reality. That's how you miss the love of God. Because the love of God's not reality to you. God is reality. This world's the matrix. It's not real. And you're living for something that's not real in real time in the presence of God. That's the dangerous part about it. That's how you miss it. You miss the love of God because you're living for your fantasy thoughts. And your fantasy thoughts are being provoked by the enemy through deception. That scripture is beautiful for those who understand God, but what about for those who don't know who God is? They're gonna miss how wide God's love is, how long God's love is, how deep God's love is, how high God's love is. They're gonna miss it. Man, I started thinking about that, and I will say, man, being a Christian for this long, it's the first time that I felt that kind of emotion, like sorrowful emotion. For those who are going to miss it, we have to wake up, people. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He has to be your reality. And also in Ephesians 3, it says that Paul was given this grace to preach this gospel to the Gentiles, the unsearchable riches of Christ. What does it mean? There's nothing in this world. You're not going to discover God in your own power and your own thinking. It has to be revealed to you. And it has to go through Christ. Christ is the revelation of God. Jesus is God. But and at the same time, he's the revelation of God. You can't know who God is apart from Jesus Christ. You can't do it. It is Jesus Christ that reveals. So, are you really really willing to die on the sword of your opinion, of what you think Jesus is, or are you willing to sit here and forget my opinion? I can't risk this. I need to know for myself, is this Jesus real? Jesus opened my eyes. I want to receive this revelation of who God is, so I don't miss how wide, how long, how deep, and how high God's love is, not just for me, but for us, for the church, for his people. It's a scary thing that something, God being so big, and you can still miss it. And then you will live with that reality for the rest of your life in eternity. The chances you had. You don't want to live with that kind of regret. You don't. Just wanted to share.